Congratulations, gentlemen. Mr. Flowers, I want to ask you about an article you wrote last year called Departmentalism in the Age of Trump. Do you remember that?
I do, Senator. It was a speech that I gave.
Yes, yeah. And as I read it, you espouse the view that each department of the federal government has a responsibility to interpret the Constitution. Did you mean each department or each branch? Tell me about that article.
They'd be synonymous in this context. So I was referring to both branches. The theory of departmentalism is the view.
So you were referring to branches?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And the theory of departmentalism, which Abraham Lincoln is perhaps the most prominent person to espouse it, is the view that every single federal official takes an oath to the Constitution and has a duty to abide by it. So you sometimes hear people say that the Constitution is what the courts say it is. And that's not quite right. Every official has a duty to interpret the Constitution. So, for example, if the Supreme Court okay.
I get it. So Congress has a right to interpret the Constitution, right?
Correct, and a duty to do so.
Okay. What happens if Congress interprets the Constitution one way and the United States Supreme Court interprets it another? Who wins?
So if that law is challenged in court, the court has a duty to say what the law is, and with respect to those parties, they'll issue a judgment. So with respect to those parties, they'll win.
I get all that, but who wins?
So in that case, the court would win with respect to the parties. The law would, Congress would be free to pass the same law again.
Given the fact that the executive branch and the legislative branch, the federal government, both have the authority to interpret the Constitution according to your theory, as well, of course, as the courts. Is there any, suppose the executive branch interprets the Constitution one way and the Supreme Court interprets it another way, who wins?
So the court will win when the case comes. The court will win in the sense that it will interpret the law, and its interpretation of the law will be binding on the parties in the case before it. But it's not necessarily binding on future parties. So the executive would be free to try the same thing again with another party.
So are you saying that if the president disagrees with an interpretation by the Supreme Court, but the president is not a party, the president can ignore the Supreme Court ruling?
He could certainly not ignore the Supreme Court.
Senator John Kennedy delivered a tense line of questioning during a Senate hearing after a judicial nominee defended the controversial theory of departmentalism, the idea that each branch of government can interpret the Constitution independently. The hearing quickly turned into a dramatic constitutional showdown as Kennedy repeatedly pressed the nominee on one key question: who wins when the Supreme Court and the president disagree? Could a president ignore a Supreme Court ruling? Can government officials defy federal court orders? And what happens if a court lacks jurisdiction? This explosive exchange dives deep into the balance of power between the judiciary, Congress, and the executive branch, with references to Abraham Lincoln, Supreme Court authority, and the limits of constitutional interpretation.
Certainly not ignore the Supreme Court ruling with respect to the parties to whom the judgment applies. But Abraham Lincoln, famous...
I'm trying to drill down to understand, Counselor, what you really said. Let's suppose that the Supreme Court issued, well, let's take Calais, the Calais decision. Okay, the Supreme Court ruled. Some like it, some don't. The president was not a party. Nor was Chairman Grassley.
Mm-hmm.
If they disagree with Calais, the president or Chairman Grassley, can they just ignore it? Is that what you're saying?
No, I wouldn't say ignore it. They're obligated to carry the judgment into effect insofar as that.
Tell me what you do. I'm confused. I'm sorry. I agree with you. Everybody should pay attention to the Constitution.
Can I provide a concrete example from history?
No, because I'm running out of time. I'm sorry. We'll talk about this later. I just don't. Do you think any of us have the right to defy a federal court order?
Generally, no, with an
What do you
exception.
mean generally?
So there's an exception for orders issued in cases where the court lacks jurisdiction. Setting that aside,
Wait, there's an exception for what?
if a court issues an order in a case in which it lacks jurisdiction, then parties are not bound by that order. But generally speaking, they are
Why
bound.
don't you just appeal it in that case?
You can do that, but the courts have.
So if in your opinion, the court didn't have jurisdiction, you can ignore it?
Again, generally, no, but there's a long-stated exception in the law that courts have recognized for when the lower court lacked jurisdiction. Now, I would never advise a client to do that, because if you're wrong, that
I hope not.
right.
I mean, this business of ignoring a federal court order is nonsense. It's nonsense on stilts. You may not agree with a court order. That's fine. This is America. You don't have to agree with it. You can. That's why God made courts of appeal. But you're not suggesting that we don't all have to give me an instant. I'm way over. Give me an instance where you think a federal court order could be ignored.
The only one of which I'm aware is if a court had no jurisdiction over the case and issues the order anyway, and you don't follow it, you cannot later be held in contempt for doing so. But aside from that, parties must follow
Who
court
gets
orders.
to determine, this is my last question, Mr. Chairman, you've been very patient. Who gets to determine whether they lack jurisdiction?
Effectively, the appeals court. That's why I would never advise a client to do this, because if you're wrong that they lack jurisdiction, then you're
Okay.
going to be held in contempt.
All right, thank you.
Please, don't forget to like, comment, and hit the subscribers button for more political updates.